Hello to our friends joining us via recording. Today we are covering lab lesson number 8. This lesson talks about nervous tissue, a whole lot about neurons. We'll spend a lot of time on that. And then we're also going to spend a lot of time on the legs. So if you notice here in the front corner of our lab, Dr. Alice is doing her squats. It's my leg day, just like it is for all of us. Audrey doesn't believe me. She's asking if I even lift. My form looks a little bit terrifying. Just saying, that is not what it would look like if I was actually doing a squat. So we'll talk about the muscles that would help us do a squat today, but hoping it wouldn't look like that. To start us off today, as we're talking about legs in the second half of our class, we wanted to remind ourselves the location of the various bones that we find in the leg or part of the lower limb. So one of my groups did something that I thought was really awesome. So shout out here to group number 2. What they did is they actually put numbers next to each of the names of the bones, and then they just put the numbers next to those things. So I'm going to go through really fast and type us some numbers. All right, so, oops, that was not great. My other group was better at that than me. Here, let's move it. All right, so when we're talking about the various bones that we see in this part of the skeleton, what I might actually do with you is I'm going to kind of go through from top to bottom, and we're going to label stuff that way. So I'm not going to go in number order. We're going to go from top to bottom. So let's start with this bone up here. When I talk about this bone up here, what would be the name, or you give me the number of this bone up here? The one that when you put your hands on your hips, this is what we're putting them on. Yeah, so this is a bone called the ilium. I'll type it on one side and then put our numbers in other places. The ilium is the hip bone. Remember, we talked about this one before spring break, I guess is when it was. When we talked about this part here being the iliac crest at the very top of the hips. In between the two halves, the two iliac bones, we have this bone here in the middle that helps us to hold them together. This forms the back part of your hips. What's this big bone back here called again? Who's that? I'm wondering what color will show up best. Yeah, so this is bone number 7. It's called the sacrum. Orange was the wrong pick. What color showed up good? Did any of my groups, what color did we decide shows up best? Maybe red is the best. Yeah, okay, we'll stick with red. I'll put it in caps, maybe that'll show up better. Okay, so that's the sacrum bone back there, sacrum number 7. That forms the middle. At the bottom of the sacrum, there's a bone I didn't make you label because we don't have any joints with it. This little tiny bone at the bottom, does anyone remember the technical name for this little tiny tailbone? Yeah, so this little guy back here is called the coccyx. I didn't make you label it. I'll type its name over here. The coccyx is the small little bone at the bottom underneath the sacrum. Fun fact about the sacrum, we're going to learn bone markings on it later in the semester. But in a lot of ways, the sacrum is basically vertebrae that fused together. So during development, we typically say this is like 3 to 5 fused vertebrae. All of these ones are individual. The sacrum, they're all fused together. And then we've got these little tiny bones here at the very bottom called the coccyx. Okay, so if these ones up here are the ilium, what's the name of the ones that we find in the very front? Right here by a joint we're going to talk about today. Who are these two ones in the front of the hips? You can give me their name or their number. Yeah, so these bones here in the front, they are called the pubis. Pubis, that's bone number 10. Remember from your regional terms that we had the pubic region that's in the front. So I'll put a little arrow pointing to those on the front. So the pubis is the bone, the two bones in the front. They're connected in the middle by the name of a joint that we're going to talk about in a moment called the pubic symphysis. So that's this middle part here that connects the two pubic bones together. So we've got the ilium up top that you put your hands on when you put your hands on your hips. Then we've got the pubis here in the front. The name of the bones of the hip that we sit on, here's a reminder, we didn't label them, but those bones are called the ischium. So you sit on your ischium, you've got the pubis bones in the very front, and you've got the ilium bones where you put your hands on your hip. Working our way down then, from the ilium and the pubis, we go down into this one. This is the largest bone in the body. I suspect we all know this one right here. I hope we all know this one. Yeah, Tien's excited. This one is the femur, absolutely. This is our femur. So we labeled the femur number 1. I'll put some number 1s around it. The femur is going to have a lot of muscles on top of it and a lot of muscles attaching to it. By the way, as we are really working on bone markings, especially here in the leg, here's something to keep in mind. Like when I'm looking at the back side of the femur here, I've got some bone markings up here at the top. I've got a bone marking that extends down. We've got bone markings at the edge. All of these bone markings, the reason that we're learning them is because they are attachment sites for particular muscles. So if you see a muscle that has a lot of weird shapes on it, or in our case, a lot of weird bone markings that we're learning, that tells you there's a lot of different muscles that make that bone move. So there's a lot of muscles that make the bone move. Audrey's saying, yeah, the muscles on the leg are difficult. We're going to try to work through them some today to work on identifying them. But there are a ton of muscles that attach all over the femur. They help the femur to move not only up here at the hip joint, but also down here at the knee joint as well. So lots of muscles attached to the femur. When we go down here into the shin region, there's 2 bones down here, not as many muscles, but 2 bones. What's the name of the bigger bone that I find in the shin? My hint being it's shaped like the letter T. Yeah, exactly. That T bone is the tibia. Tibia, we labeled tibia number 9. So the tibia is always going to be medial. Medial meaning toward the middle. The tibia is here in the middle. Oh yeah, somebody's already helping me out here with my other bone that we have on the outside. Here, I'll move our label over here. My little one here on the outside then is the fibula, right? So the tibia in the middle, the fibula on the outside. That's going to be really important that we remember tibia versus fibula when we start talking about these little bumps that you feel in your ankle. So here's a teaser for the word we're going to use later in class today. Those bumps that you feel on either side of your feet, or of your ankle joint, excuse me, they are called a malleolus. That's a word that means bump. So we've got the lateral malleolus, it's on the fibula, because the fibula is on the outside, and the medial malleolus in the middle, that's on the tibia. So never tell me that the tibia has the lateral malleolus, because the tibia doesn't live on the outside. The tibia lives on the inside. And never tell me that the fibula has the medial malleolus, because the fibula lives on the lateral side. So knowing where these bones are can help us out with some of those bone markings. So keep that in mind. Fibula on the outside, tibia on the middle. Then we go into all of the foot bones that make up the ankle joint. So the ones that are right here in the ankle itself. What are those ones called that are kind of right in the ankle region? Yeah, those bones that are there at the bottom half of the ankle joint are called the tarsals. So number 8, my tarsal bones. This week we are learning, so at the beginning of the semester we learned them as a group. This week we're going to learn each of their names. So lots of specific names that we're going to learn this week. I'll give you a phrase to try to help us learn them. But all of these bones that make up the back part of your foot, these are called the tarsals. And then right in front of the tarsals, we have what are called the metatarsals. So I'll put a little line here. Actually, I'll draw 2 lines. So my middle bones that are next to the tarsals are the metatarsals. And at the very end, you have your toe bones. Those are the phalanges of the foot. So number 6 on our list, phalanges. So remember, we start in the back, toward the posterior. These are the tarsal bones, the metatarsals mixed in, and the phalanges there in the front. So here's all of our bones. Oh, except for one. I forgot to label number 5. Here, I'll let you all help me out. Grab that pencil up above my pointer up here. Circle for me or put an arrow. Where's the patella? Number 5. My daughter knows where her patella is. I'm so proud of her. My little 4-year-old. There we go. I was going to say, really? Only 2 of us know where the patella is? That's perfect. We know where our patella is. Awesome. Okay, so hopefully this was a good review for you of the location of these particular bones, because now we're going to flip over and we're going to talk about the joints in between them. So we talked about, before we started group work, for my friends here on the recording, that the names of the joints that I see in the leg, a lot of them come from the names of the 2 bones that are coming together. So I'm going to kind of color code joints to help us rather than trying to type stuff out. So we'll actually work our way through this list in order, because I think that'll be easiest for us. So first one we talked about even before we split up into groups, the femoropatellar joint. The femoropatellar joint, remind me in the chat, what bones is the femoropatellar joint between? Femoropatellar. Yeah, exactly. So the first part tells me femur, the second part tells me patella. So I'm going to put a little line here next to the top of my patella here. Where we would actually see it is kind of right behind the patella. So the patella is kind of on top of the femur. So kind of right behind the patella, between it and the femur. That's the femoropatellar joint. And you can feel this on yourself. So when you swing your leg out and in, you can feel your patella staying stationary, but that femur moving past it a little bit. By the way, I think I mentioned this last week. I want to make sure I mention it this week for sure. You can, and I encourage you to, use your body when you're taking this exam, when you're doing the homework assignment over this kind of stuff. So please feel your femoropatellar joint. Know where that joint is. That's going to be important and helpful for you as we're trying to identify all the different joints this week, all the different bone markings. So femoropatellar joint, that is one joint that is found in the knee. Hey, while we're at it, let's find another joint in the knee. So here I'm going to draw another joint for us here. I'm drawing it in red. Can anyone tell what joint I am highlighting here in red? What joint did I find here? It's between this bone and that T-bone down there. Yeah, so Kira mentioned it's got a long name, right? So we're looking at the joint between the tibia in the bottom and the femur in the top. This joint that I have highlighted here in red in each of these places is called the Tibiofemoral Joint. The Tibiofemoral Joint, between the tibia and the femur, the place where those 2 bones meet. Hey, just below or just inferior to the tibia and the femur, the tibiofemoral joint, I see a joint right here. Remind me which 2 bones we're looking at right here. Who are the 2 bones that we find here? Let me get a color to color code my joint. Yeah, so we are seeing one of the bones that we just talked about, the tibia, right? And this particular joint, highlighted in green, is where the tibia is interacting with the fibula. Now, this is the place where the tibia and the fibula interact that's up higher. So my options are either superior or inferior. Which of those words meant that it was up higher? Superior or inferior? Yeah, exactly. Several of us chiming in. Superior means we're up higher. So my green joint that I see here, between the tibia and the fibula up higher, that's called the superior tibiofibular joint. If we go down lower, I also have an interaction site. I'm going to change colors for that one. I also have what's called the inferior tibiofibular joint. So the other place where the tibia and the fibula interact with each other is called the inferior tibiofibular joint. Again, name tells me between the tibia and the fibula. Hey, this joint also has that name tibio in it. It's my last one that I know is found between the tibia and something. So the tibiotarsal joint is the place where the tibia interacts with the tarsal bones. In particular, there is one tarsal bone. Let me change colors again. The particular tarsal bone that we interact with is called the talus. We'll talk about the talus when we start looking at the feet. So sometimes you'll see this called the talotibial joint, but that is the particular tarsal we interact with. One of my groups had asked me where would be the best place to label that one. And I'm drawing it here in orange. Can you see my little orange line there? So the flat part of the tibia, where it meets up with the tarsal bone right next to it, that would be where I would say we find that talotibial joint, or the tibiotarsal, as we're calling it. So the top ankle bone interacting with the tibia, that's the tibiotarsal joint. I can't remember, in your lab packet, do we ask you to group the joints? So for example, do we tell you to name all of the joints that are found near the ankle or found near the knee? Okay, so Kira's saying yes. If we don't ask you in the packet, I'm pretty sure we ask you on the homework assignment too. So awesome. This is a great way to study these joints. We just talked about right here in the ankle, this joint is called the tibiotarsal joint. That's one of the specific joints in the ankle. Right next door neighbor to it is the inferior tibiofibular joint. That would be another example of a joint we find near the ankle. Remind me, this bone and its neighbors that are right next to it, what was that group of bones called again? All these bones that I find here in the back of the foot? Yeah, exactly. Those bones are called the tarsals. So the other joint, I'm going to kind of circle here in the back part of the foot. The other joint that you'd find in the ankle are what are called the intertarsal joints. The joints that are in between the bones that are called the tarsals. So in between every single tarsal bone, we've got multiple, we'll name them today. In between the talus and the calcaneus, that would be an example of an intertarsal joint. Or in between the calcaneus and the navicular, that would be another example of an intertarsal joint. So if you see two bone names that are both tarsal bones, the kind of joint that's in between them is an intertarsal joint. So we actually have lots of these intertarsal joints. We also have lots of the tarso-metatarsal joints. So the places where the tarsal bones meet with the metatarsals. This is going to be a little bit hard to see. I'm going to do my best to try to circle here where we'd see that, but the tarso-metatarsal joints are kind of going to be a line. This poor skeleton's foot here. The place where, again, where those tarsal bones that are truly in the ankle interact with the metatarsal bones. And then we've got, so I should color code that. Then we've got the joints that are in between all of the bones of the toes. Fun fact, you actually have 14 different toe bones for each toe, each phalange. So we've got all kinds of these interphalangeal joints. The interphalangeal joints are going to be the joints that we find in between the toes. So we'll circle those guys down here. Interphalangeal joints, you can kind of see them on the other side over here too. Okay. So all that leaves for me then, we've hit the knee and below, lots of joints down there. All that leaves for me then is the pubic symphysis and the sacroiliac joint. We talked a little bit about the pubic symphysis just a moment ago. What bones is the pubic symphysis around, or in between, more accurately? Yeah, so it's in between the two halves of the pubis. So the pubic symphysis, I'm going to circle it right here. It's actually this place right here. You know the type of tissue that's found in the pubic symphysis. Yeah, exactly. So Kira is reminding us the kind of tissue that the pubic symphysis is made out of is fibrocartilage. So if you remember back from your tissue location and function guide, that thing we hated, right? It's all coming back to us now because fibrocartilage is what makes this attachment site between the two pubis bones. So the pubic symphysis made out of fibrocartilage, we see that here on the front side, holding the two halves of your hip together. The other joint that we have is the joint on the back side called the sacroiliac joint. The sacroiliac joint. I would say that this joint is near and dear to my heart, except that makes it sound like I like this joint. This joint is actually because this whole being at home online stuff, my sacroiliac joint has not loved it. My chiropractor has to keep adjusting that SI joint for me. So between the sacrum and the iliac bone, or the ilium bone, the sacroiliac joint in between. Yeah, Audrey asked about the sciatic nerve. The sciatic nerve actually runs, you see this little divot right here? So it's not quite in the same place as the joint, but is very near to it. The sciatic nerve comes down through this thing called the greater sciatic notch. So it's this divot where the sciatic nerve will come down right there in that place. So it's near the sacroiliac joint, but not quite there. Both things can be very painful though. The SI joint, I can speak to that pain. And probably several of us can speak to sciatic nerve pain too, sciatica. We'll mention that when we are talking about the nerves of the body. So that's in like 3 weeks, maybe. We'll start talking about spinal nerves, I think. All right, so this is the extent of what I'm going to do with joints with you in this lab. Please make sure, number one, we can explain where these joints are found, so what bones they're found in between. And then number two, make sure that you can find them on a picture like we see here. So finding each of these joints that we have in the lower limb. Oh yeah, thank you. Kira reminded me. There is one other joint in this picture that I didn't put on the list because its name doesn't really match up with any particular bone names. That one other joint that we do need to know this week is called the Coxal Joint. The Coxal Joint. Can you remind me in the chat, where was the Coxal Region? This was one where a regional term is coming back to haunt us. Yeah, so the Coxal Region was the hip region. The hip region. So the Coxal Joint, I'm going to draw it here with a little blue. The Coxal Joint is this one up here at the top. So where the femur interacts with the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis, that thing, yeah, that Kira mentioned called the acetabulum, that big divot, that's the Coxal Joint up there. So one other joint here in the lower limb is that Coxal Joint. That one you're just going to have to memorize because its name doesn't match up bones. Most of the names match up bones. Coxal Joint, not so much. All right, how do we feel about joints? Thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs in the middle. Okay, since we're talking about the legs, We're gonna have a dance party. My dancing emoji came out. I can't remember which of my groups it was. If it was one, or I think it was group number 1 that I gave you all the 3 penguins because you gave me a penguin. So remind me again at the end to draw you a penguin for the day. All right, so let's talk about content. We'll switch gears a little bit. I like it. Kaylin gave me somebody standing on their head. That's perfect. This week's lesson, 2 parts. We've started talking about the bone and joints parts of it. The other part of this, though, is nervous tissue. So, friendly reminder for you that when we look at nervous tissue, remember that this was the type of tissue that had the dark blue or dark purple cells with the pink background on them. When we look at nervous tissue, there are 2 types of cells that you see in it. So these big cells that we see here that are almost kind of star-shaped, these are the cells called neurons. I'll make sure to label that for us here. These are my neurons. And then we also have cells, the little tiny dots that you see there in the lower left side, called neuroglia. So when you're first looking at nervous tissue, you should always make sure you can differentiate between these big, large neurons that we see here and these little neuroglia that are next to them. Does anyone remember, was it the neuroglia or the neurons? Which of these 2 types of cells helps you to think? Is it the neurons or the neuroglia that are the thinking cells? Yeah, exactly. So these big ones, these neurons, they are the cells that help you to think. Neurons, we're going to spend a whole lecture lesson talking about exactly how neurons help you to think. So these are our thinking cells. Yeah, Kaylin calls these the pretty ones. So the big, pretty star-shaped cells, those are my neurons. They think. My neuroglia are what we might call the helper cells. So the ones that help my neurons have these weird shapes. The ones that are going to make sure that my neurons stay safe so they don't get a viral infection or have the food they need, all that kind of stuff. That's the job of the neuroglia. So when you're looking at the cells, here's another image for us to see. Notice that we have these dark cells that we see inside here, and then the little tiny neuroglia. They're much smaller. I like it. Kira says they kind of look like ghosts. This one kind of looks like a ghost. By the way, what makes these so dark blue is actually proteins. So you can kind of see on this one here, see how there's little lines that are inside these cells? Those are all of my cytoskeleton proteins. It's not easy for a cell to be shaped like this. It takes a lot of proteins to make that happen. So you can see those little spindly cytoskeleton proteins that are helping this neuron to stretch out. The parts where it receives messages, these little skinny parts that stick out, those are called dendrites. And then we'll have longer extensions that go down that are called the axon, where we send messages away. If you get up close and personal with a neuron, I love this picture of neurons, nerding out teacher moment here. When we look up close and personal, we can see this circle right here that definitely looks like an eye, right? So it looks like there's a pupil and a little eye here. So this whole thing right here is the nucleus of this neuron. So I can see the nucleus. This nucleus has a dark spot in the middle. Does anyone happen to remember the organelle that we find in the middle of the nucleus? Yeah, Kira mentioned that thing called the nucleolus. The nucleolus, the little nucleus, the thing that makes ribosomes. So I can look up close at the nucleus and see the little nucleolus in the middle. You can also see all of those little tiny cytoskeleton proteins inside of here. So being stretched out so funny takes a lot of proteins. We can see those proteins inside our neurons. And then again, you can see how much smaller these little neuroglia are compared to our neuron. Much, much smaller. These are the support cells that keep it alive. In addition to finding neuron structures on the tissue images of neurons, you also need to be able to identify them on our neuron models. Now, this particular neuron model, I love the detail on it. I don't love the way they show it to you. Here's what I want you to think about with this neuron. Imagine that it actually looks like this. So pretend like that part of the model that's underneath it is attached right here, because that's what a neuron actually looks like. So we're going to go through and we're going to label some stuff together here. On yours, it's going to look like this, where you have this part down below the other part. I'm going to go ahead and label it on here just because it is a little easier to see. So let's start our labeling by labeling the part that is down below on your picture, but that we actually see here extending out. The big long extension that comes off of a neuron, this is the part of the neuron called the axon. So the axon of a neuron is how it sends information away. Neurons are all about communicating. So this is the longest extension that comes off of a neuron, and it sends information away. The information that it sends away is coming from a part of the neuron. Let me draw a bracket for us. The part of the neuron called the cell body. The cell body. So the cell body, this is the part when we were looking at those neuron images. The cell body is the part that looked dark blue. So all of this space, when you're doing that homework assignment, look for that bracket representing the whole area. That's going to be the cell body. Yeah, or Fanshin mentioned some of the sources you'll see. The other name for cell body is also called the soma. The soma. So the cell body, or the soma, the big part of the neuron. Inside it, you can see, like we saw on our slide, right? We saw the nucleus, and you can actually see that little nucleolus in the middle as well on the model. Inside the cell body, along with the nucleus and the nucleolus, you also have all of these little blue spots that you see here. And we saw some of these when we were looking at our slides there. In addition to being proteins, what a lot of these blue spots are things called nasal bodies. Nasal bodies. Now, Dr. Nasal is very excited that he has an organelle named after him. But when you're thinking about the function of nasal bodies, we can think of them as a neuron special version of another organelle that we know about. Nasal bodies make proteins. What was the name of the big organelle that makes proteins? The big one, not the tiny ones, the big one. Yeah, exactly. So think about nasal bodies as the rough endoplasmic reticulum, or the rough ER of a neuron. So all of these nasal bodies here in the cell body, these are proteins. And they're kind of a version of our rough ER, the proteins that we find inside here. When a cell is figuring out what message it wants to send to its neighbors, it wants to send out of the axon, that neuron is using the messages that it received from other neighboring cells. So when we think about other neighboring cells sending messages, the place they're going to send those messages are all of these little extensions that you see coming off of here. These extensions, the places where our neuron receives messages, are called the dendrites. So lots of dendrites that we see on here all over. Here, I'll attach my lines here. Dendrites are the short extensions that come off of the cell body. Dendrites receive messages. Those messages come into the cell body, and then we have this little triangle-shaped space right here on our neuron. Let me put a little square around that here. This triangle-shaped space, different color, bear with me. Okay. This space right here is what we call the Axon Hillock. The Axon Hillock. This is the place where a neuron takes all of the messages that it heard and it mixes them together. I kind of like to think of the Axon Hillock like a blender. We drop everything in the blender, we mix it all up, and we decide what message to send down the axon. So the place where the axon attaches to the cell body is called the Axon Helic. A word that we're going to use a bunch in lecture related to what we do at the Axon Hillock. It's a process called integration. Integration, where you take all of the messages that each of our dendrites received, and again, we mix them together to process them, to figure out what we should say. And if we should say something, we will send that something down the axon to talk to our neighbor. When we send messages down the axon, the long, far away part of a neuron, we want those messages to go quickly and we want them to go accurately. The way that we do that is by building this little yellow blanket, if you will, or it's this thing, coat that we're wrapping around our axon. So all of this area that we wrap around our axon, this yellow stuff that I see all over the place here, all of this yellow is something that we call myelin. So this is what we call the myelin sheath, or the myelin coat, you could think of it, around our axons. Myelin is literally a type of fat. So by wrapping up our axons in fat, we keep our messages in the axon going quickly, we keep them strong, and we're moving it down the axon. Now on these particular neurons, notice that these myelin sheaths, all these little layers of fat that we see here, are actually made by a cell. So here, I'm going to take off my circle so you can see that a little more clearly. This right here is the nucleus of a cell. This particular cell, so this whole thing, you'd see it on the homework assignment with a box around it. So this whole cell that we see right here is something called a Schwann cell. Schwann cell. I'll connect the line here. So a Schwann cell is the type of cell, here's its nucleus, that I use to form the myelin sheath. Think about the way that we form the myelin sheath, like if you went up and hugged a flagpole and then you walked in circles and circles and circles around that flagpole, except every time you walked around it, you left a layer of your clothing on it or something like that. So all of this myelin sheath is the membrane of the Schwann cell that it just kept going and going and going, stretching it out. That's the myelin sheath of our Schwann cell. And again, it makes our messages go quicker down the axon. When we get to the end of the axon, which is not included on our model here, but when we get all the way to the end of the axon, we reach something that's called the Axon Terminal. Now, on this model, you can't see the axon terminals at the end of the axon, but you can see them up here. See all these little orange things that are attached to my dendrites here? Each of these little things are the axon terminals. So these are the places where a message goes from one neuron to another, the axon terminal. So in this case, we're seeing the axon terminals of the neighboring neurons that were talking to this one. But those axon terminals attach to the dendrites of a neuron. That neuron receives a message, processes it in the cell body, and down into the Axon Hillock, and sends it away in the axon. I guess, okay, so there's only one. Is this the only thing we have left, right? The node of RON VA? I think we found all of our other stuff. Let me scoot over this box just to show you the one other structure that we are labeling, and it's a little hard to see on here, but when you're looking at your picture, there's kind of a little bit of a space between the two Schwann cells. They're pretty close together, but a little tiny space called the nodes of RON VA. Nodes of RON VA. The nodes of RON VA are the one place, or there's one actually with each of these spaces here in between the Schwann cells. This is the one place where there's not myelin on the axon of these neurons. By not having myelin there, we're actually able to take our electrical signal from here and then kind of jump it to the next node. And then we jump it to the next node. So we'll talk about this more in lecture, but the node of Ranvier is the only place on the axon where there is not myelin. That allows us to send messages more quickly. How do we feel about this neuron model before we flip to our other neuron model? Yeah, go ahead, Fanchin.
Okay, I'm gonna try to describe our neuron on page 2 because I have a question of it. Coming off of the soma body, we have the short little things that I guess would be the dendrites. And then on the end of one of those, it has some more green stuff coming off. I don't know if you remember what it looks like. So now when we were talking, yes, that's exactly it. So the green thing coming off, is that a dendrite or would that be an entering axon terminal?
Yeah, so this part up here is the best that we can see the dendrites.
Okay.
On this model. The dendrites typically branch a whole bunch, so we can see the branching on here. If this model was a little more accurate, or maybe way back in the day when it was actually first bought for the lab, it might have had dendrites coming off of all of these. But this is the best representation of dendrites on here.
Okay,
so dendrites do typically branch a lot like that. Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to double check on that because I had it labeled as the dendrite, but then I started second guessing when we started talking about the other end of the axon.
Yeah, so we can label all of these right here. So when we're on the other neuron model, all of those would represent dendrites, whether it's the, and typically, if we're asking you on the homework assignment, this is probably where we're going to flag those dendrites. But yeah, these are all kind of look like they could be extensions for dendrites as well. But yeah, that's a great question. It looks different, right? I kind of like to joke in class that this is what it would look like if I made a neuron myself as an art project. This is what my neuron would look like. And then there's the other one that we labeled that looks way more accurate and more detailed. But this is the art teacher version of dendrites, or of a neuron in general with those little dendrites. Do you happen to remember? Here's those little blue spots. What was the name of those little blue spots that I find all over the place in the cell body? That's the one thing I kind of like the best about this model. We can see these real good. Yeah, these are those weird things called the Nasal Bodies, right? Nasal Bodies. So proteins, Nasal Bodies up there. You can also see really well on here, see this red line that they made. That's the place where I don't have myelin, that red line. So remember, those places that we don't have myelin are called the nodes of Ranvier. So we've got a node of Ranvier right here. And then the myelin sheath would be this yellow that I see in these two places here. And you can see that Schwann cell, we can see a little bit better. Remember how I told you it's kind of wrapping around the axon. You can see it kind of reaching around to form that myelin sheath. So there's my Schwann cell. The yellow inside here being that myelin sheath. The gray is that axon where I send the message away. Notice on this particular model that at the end of my axon, I can see all of those little axon terminals attached. So all of these little circles that you see down here are those axon terminals at the end, or the termination of the axon. Any other questions about this particular model? Or give me a thumbs up. We've gone very quiet. Okay, well, if you think of some other questions, feel free to toss them out. We'll keep tracking with this stuff to try to make sure we have time for other things too. The end of a neuron is where we have that thing called the axon terminal. The other name for an axon terminal is called the synaptic knob, because the place that two neurons talk to each other is called a synapse. So all of this is the synaptic knob, or the axon terminal, the end of the line for a message. Each of these little bubbles that you see inside here are called synaptic vesicles. A vesicle is a bubble that includes neurotransmitters or includes the messages that one neuron is sending to another. So the little fuzzies that you see inside here are the neurotransmitters. We will talk all about neurotransmitters as we start talking about neurons in the coming weeks. So synaptic vesicles, each of my bubbles. This is where the axon would be, the entire model being that axon terminal. So all of this is zooming in on one of these right here to give you frame of reference. So this is my axon terminal little, my axon terminal big. Where we're going to be talking in lecture starting tomorrow is a place called the Neuromuscular Junction. The Neuromuscular Junction. So I'm circling for you here in black. The only thing you really have to label on our muscle models here is the area called the Neuromuscular Junction, where one axon terminal meets with a muscle cell. Let's see if we can remember which particular kind of muscle tissue do I see in this picture here. What kind of muscle tissue is this one? Can we tell? Yeah, a couple of us chiming in. This is skeletal muscle tissue. A couple of ways I can tell. The first one is because I have these protein tubes called my myofibrils. And the second way is because I can see these dark spots with the yellow around it. Remember that these dark lines here are what we call T-tubules. And next to them, we're seeing that sarcoplasmic reticulum, where I stored the calcium and then released it to get the proteins in the myofibrils to contract. So the neuromuscular junction, where a neuron sends a message to a muscle cell, telling that muscle cell to contract. When we talk about neurons, there are three kinds of neurons in the body. So far, what we've been looking at are neurons that look like this one over here. For my friends who've had a chance to work on this lesson, what is the name of neurons that look like this? What are those neurons called? Yeah, absolutely. So let's start chiming in. These are called multipolar neurons. Multipolar. This polar word is referring to how many extensions come off of the cell body of the neuron. So here's my cell body. Notice how I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This particular one has 6 things coming off of it. 6 is more than 1, and it's more than 2. Those are the only options. We got what we call unipolar with 1 extension, bipolar with 2 extensions, or multipolar, more than 2. Again, most of the neurons in the body are multipolar neurons, 3 or more extensions. When we talk about unipolar neurons, notice how there's just 1 extension coming off of the cell body here. So unipolar neurons are ones that have 1 extension. So on one end, I'm going to have my dendrites that receive information. That information doesn't ever go to the cell body. It just goes straight into the axon, where we send it off at the axon terminals. Here's a note for us to make ourselves about unipolar neurons. These are always sensory neurons. Always sensory neurons. This word unipolar is what I call the structural classification of a neuron. So it tells me what it looks like. The other thing we need to know about neurons is their functional classification. So functional classification is what you do in life. A unipolar neuron is always going to be doing the same function. It's always going to be doing sensory stuff. So it collects sensory information, doesn't even think about it, just sends it straight on for somebody else to think about it. When we're talking about thinking about stuff, that's what multipolar neurons do. So multipolar neurons do that thing called integration or processing. Multipolar neurons. The other thing that multipolar neurons do is we call them motor neurons, so they control things. Multipolar neurons either can be motor neurons or they can be integrating neurons. I guess the word I think we use in our lab packet, do we call them interneurons? Is that correct? Interneurons? Yeah, okay. So the two functional classifications of these neurons, processors called interneurons, or motor neurons that control things. That's what, if you're shaped like this, you could have either of these jobs, be an interneuron or a motor neuron. If you're shaped like this, if you're unipolar, you're always just going to be sensory stuff. That's all you can do. Bipolar neurons, like this one over here, these are the least common kind of neuron in the body. So when we talk about bipolar neurons, they have two extensions, one up here with the dendrites, one down here with the axon. These are another type of sensory neuron, but we actually call these special sensory neurons. Special sensory. This is going to be stuff like vision and hearing, smell. So your special senses are done with bipolar neurons. The rest of your sensory information, like touch or temperature, those kind of things, that's unipolar neurons. So watch your questions on the homework. Make sure that if your question is asking you for the structural classification of a neuron, you use what I call a polar word. So we're bipolar, we're unipolar, or we're multipolar. How many extensions are coming off of the cell body? That's the polar word, or the structural classification for a neuron. If we ask you for the functional classification of a neuron, our options are sensory, motor, or an interneuron. And we might be, in that sensory category, we might be a special sensory neuron. So keep those things in mind. We use these, or we apply these ideas when we're looking at what we call a reflex arc. So reflexes, again, coming up in a few weeks here in lab. Reflexes are stuff that your body does always without you even thinking about it. Your body just does these responses. So the way a reflex arc works is we detect something. So for example, the stove is hot. That's what we detect. We send that information to the spinal cord, for example, where we figure out that, oh, I'm detecting it's hot. I probably should move my hand away. And we send that information out to the muscles in your body to make sure that you move your hand away. You don't consciously think about the process of withdrawing your hand when you touch something hot. It happens faster than you can think about it. That's because of these reflex arcs. A reflex arc always follows the same set of functional neurons. We always go the same way. So the kind of neuron that we start with, every reflex arc, is the kind of neuron that can detect things or can pick up stuff in the environment. Which functional classification of neurons do you think would be really good at detecting information from the environment? Who's really good at collecting information? Yeah, exactly. Sarah's chiming in. That's the job of sensory neurons. Sensory neurons. They collect information from the environment. Every reflex starts with a sensory neuron collecting information. They send that information into, this is the spinal cord, which is part of the central nervous system. So your really good processing part of the nervous system. What was our type of neuron that we said was really good at processing? Who would I find living here in the spinal cord? My processors. Yeah, so my processors are interneurons. And actually, Laura picked up on an important thing too. We always said, remember that processing neurons for their structural classification are multipolar neurons, multipolar. If we didn't have that memorized, if we didn't know off the top of our head that interneurons are going to be multipolar, the other way we could figure that out is if you look at this picture, I've got my cell body with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 extensions coming off again. It's more than 2, so it's going to be multipolar. Hey, this one down here has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 extensions. What word would I use to describe its structural classification if I've got 5 extensions coming off of here? What polar word do we use for this one? Yeah, it's another multipolar, right? Another multipolar neuron. This multipolar neuron, though, is not a processing neuron. This is a multipolar neuron that makes something happen. It talks to my muscle cells. What's the functional classification of neurons that talk to muscle tissue? Yeah, exactly. A couple of us have chimed in. That's the job of motor neurons. Motor neurons. So every reflex arc starts with a sensory neuron that talks to an interneuron that decides what we should do, and the motor neuron makes that happen, tells us, it gets that going for us. We talked about how these two neurons are both multipolar neurons. We forgot to fill that structural classification in up here. What structural classification would I say is this sensory neuron back here? What classification do I call this one? Exactly, this one back here is actually a unipolar neuron. A unipolar neuron, absolutely. We have one extension, so here's the cell body, one little extension sticking out on this one. So unipolar neurons, the only kind of neuron they can ever be functionally is a sensory neuron. We can see that sensory neuron back here. How do we feel about structural and functional classifications of our neurons? Structural and functional. Thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs in the middle. Yeah, Audrey's got a question. Go for it. Yeah, so Audrey said you mentioned unipolar is always sensory. That's correct. Will that mean that all sensory neurons are unipolar? As long as they are not special sensory neurons. So as long as we're not talking, here, I'll make a list for you here. As long as we're not talking about vision, not talking about hearing, not talking about, I'll give you the fancy word for this here, equilibrium. That's balance, taste, and smell. Oop, spelled that one wrong. This is a list over here of the 5 special senses. Special senses were the ones that used bipolar neurons. So all sensory neurons are unipolar unless they're a special sensory neuron. Then they would be bipolar. Yeah, so it's one of those weird logic puzzles, right? So all unipolar neurons are sensory neurons, but not all sensory neurons are unipolar. Most of them are. Special sensory are not. Yeah, good clarifying question there. I know, Fanshin's laughing at that, the logic puzzle there, right? All right, I think, yeah. So with that, we are done with nervous tissue stuff, and that just brings us to bones and muscles. I'm gonna see how much time we have at the end of class. Where I wanna spend my time today is not on the bone markings, because you've got some great resources to help you out with labeling bone markings. Where I wanna spend our time today right now is working on muscles. especially working on muscle movements too. So please make sure to refer to the guided lesson, or I've said it before, I'll say it again. Google Images is your best friend for labeling those bone markings, for labeling even the muscles. We'll talk about them some today, but check out Google Images as well when you're working on labeling things. First thing we need to know as we're trying to work on the movements of muscles in the body is we need to know where those muscles are found. Now, let me show you where we're going. We'll come back and name these muscles here in a moment. When we're working on learning movements, oops, I went too far, movements of the leg, the way we're asking you to memorize movements of the leg, you could go through for each of the individual muscles and memorize a list of their movements. What we would prefer that you do is that you memorize these general rules. So you see these in your lab packet. It says that the muscles that I find on the anterior and the medial aspects or the sides of the thigh are going to flex the femur at the coxal joint. The muscles that live on the posterior side of the thigh are going to extend the femur at the coxal joint. You could go through and memorize the list of muscles that you have there underneath each of these rules and what they do. Or if we just know the general rule and we know the location of our muscles, we don't have to memorize a muscle name and its action. So here, let's do this together. Yeah, so Audrey mentioned, for those of us taking notes, thank you, Audrey, we're on page 12 of the lab packet, page 12. When we're talking about these movements here, we got flexion and extension, and then we got the names of bone, we got a joint name. We need to break down this statement into little parts to make sure we're remembering everything. Let's start here with this word flex. Who can remember, I think this was before spring break, that we last talked about flexion. What does it mean if I flex something? What does this word flex mean? Anybody remember? I'm also going to put a little note for extend because we got to know these both. Okay, so when we're talking about this joint, Audrey is correct. Flexing does mean, in the case of this joint, that it moves it up. Yeah, so Fanshin mentioned in general, when we talk about flexing, we're bringing things together. Our technical description was that we made the angle smaller, but I like to think about it bringing bones together. That's what we're going to call for flexion. We're going to say that flexion means we're bringing bones together. Extension is the opposite of flexion. So with extension, we're pushing bones apart, we'll say, pushing bones apart. Technically, here, let's put our angles in here. Making a smaller angle, that's the technical description of flexion, and then making a bigger angle. That's my description of extension. Okay, so the first part of my rule, we're talking about muscles that bring bones closer together. So in this case, it brings the femur closer to the pelvis, or extension, we're making the femur go farther away from the pelvis. Notice that we've got a note here that we're at the coxal joint. That was that one that was not named based on the bones. Where was that coxal joint again? Do you remember what the coxal joint was? Yeah, we're absolutely right. The coxal joint is the hip joint. Hip joint. When you are memorizing these rules, and by the way, I totally recommend memorizing these rules. When you memorize them, make sure you know what joint you're talking about, because it's going to get a little dicey when we compare the coxal joint to the knee joint. I'll show you that soon. But here's how I think you should make your flashcards. Go home and make your I just said go home and you're like, dude, Dr. Ellis, we're at home already, right? So you're already at home. I just saved you a step. We're not home to make our flashcards. We're making our flashcards right now. Here's what I think you should do. Front side. Yeah, Caitlin's like, haven't we been home long enough? Oh, I feel that, believe me. So at the place that you're stuck, that you can't leave, pull out a flashcard. Front side of your flashcard, you say, muscles on the anterior and medial thigh do what to the femur? And on the back side, you say, flex it at the hip joint. So muscles on the front side and the medial side of the thigh, what do they do to the femur? They flex the femur at the hip joint. New note card, muscles on the posterior side of the thigh. What do they do to the femur at the hip joint? They extend it. So we're memorizing these rules so that when I ask you about a muscle like Rectus Femoris, I'll label this one here for us, Rectus Femoris. If you know that Rectus Femoris lives on the front side of the thigh, and you know that anybody who lives on the front side flexes the femur at the hip joint, you'll be able to tell me that. You can tell me that Rectus Femoris flexes the femur at the coxal joint. That's its action. You'd be able to tell me that, let me see if I can remember some of the ones I made you all do this with. Did we, I think we included this one, right? For my friends who have labeled, who did I just label right here? Do you remember yet? Any ideas? Maybe we don't know. The leg is a little tricky. This is one that sounds like the ones that we have in the arm. This one's called Biceps Femoris. Biceps Femoris. Fanchin mentioned another one we do have to know. We'll go ahead and label that one too while we're at it. The one in the middle is called Semitendinosus Tendonosis. Oop, I spelled that wrong. Sorry, refer to your packet because I'm not typing all that again. Semitendinosus, that's in the middle. Biceps femoris, more toward the outside. Semitendinosus, more toward the inside. Both of these muscles, though, are found on the back, or they're found on the posterior side of the leg, the posterior side of the thigh. So if I asked you what the function of biceps femoris is at the hip joint, you would know, because biceps femoris lives on the back side, that it extends the femur at the coxal joint. Now, here's a good time for you to be acting some things out. Flexion of the femur. I presume that most, if not all of us, are sitting down right now. Let me explain to you so you can do this with your body. Flexion of the femur is when you take your femur, you take your thigh, and you bring it toward your chest. So flexing your femur is bringing your thigh up toward your chest. That's flexion. Extension is when that femur goes back down. Extension is actually easier to see, though, when you're standing up. Extension of your femur is when you put your leg toward the back of your body. So if you're kind of lifting it up behind you, extending the femur toward your back, flexing the femur toward your front. So if I'm a muscle who lives on the back side of the thigh, I'm going to pull the femur toward the back side at the hip joint. I'm going to extend the femur at the hip joint. If I'm a muscle that lives on the front or the medial portion, so let's meet a medial friend right here. This is the adductor group, the adductor group. These muscles also assist us with the process of flexion, of bringing the leg forward. I believe we also make you know this one right here. This one that reaches across is called sartorius. Sartorius. We've also, let's see, we've also got a little friend here. That line that you see in the very middle, that's called gracilis. All of these muscles that are on the front or here in the medial aspect of the thigh, all of these flex. They pull the femur forward. All the muscles on the back side. Here's some other friends on the back side. We should know this big one back here. Who's this? This one's named after its regional term. I hope we all know this one. Yeah, this is our gluteal region, right? This is the big one in the gluteal region. So there's, yep, gluteus maximus. Gluteus maximus. That's going to be another one that helps us to extend the femur at the hip joint. Okay, so remember, we're already at home, so we need to pull out a flashcard since we're at home. Front side. What do my muscles on the anterior side of the thigh do to the femur? Backside. They flex it at the coxal joint. Or what do my muscles on the posterior side of the thigh do? They extend the femur at the coxal joint. We can also talk about muscles that live on the lateral side versus the medial side doing another set of movement words. Those movement words are abduct and adduct. Can anyone remind me, what do these abduct or adduct words mean? Which way are we moving with these particular words? Yeah, so Fanchon's right. Abduct and adduct are all about the midline of the body. So when we talk about abducting the femur, we're moving away, oops, caps lock's on here, away from the midline. This is when an alien abducts you, right? Adduct is when we go toward the midline. The good news about this rule is it's going to be really easy to memorize. If you live on the outside of the thigh, when you contract, you move the femur away from the midline. If I live in the middle, I'm going to move the femur toward the midline of the body. So I've got muscles like the Adductor Group. That's our favorite, right? Because its name tells us what it does. The Adductor Group is going to pull the leg toward the middle. Whereas here's a new one. This one up here is called gluteus medius. Medius, we're medium-sized compared to maximus. That's going to help us out with abduction because it's on the outside of the leg. So if you live on the outside of the leg, gluteus maximus, or excuse me, like gluteus medius, you're doing abduction. If you live along the inside, so that adductor muscle we talked about, or this long skinny one in the middle called gracilis, this little graceful muscle in the middle, that's going to help us with adduction. So if you live in the middle, you pull the thigh toward the middle. If you live on the outside, you pull the thigh toward the outside. See how it would help us to just memorize the rules? If we know the rules and we know where these muscles live, we don't have to memorize their particular actions. We know who lives where, and we know what the muscles that live in those places do. Okay, here's where things get real. Remember how I told you we had to pay attention to our rules before that we're moving the femur at the hip joint? Now we're talking about moving the tibia at the Tibiofemoral Joint. We've now moved down to the knee. Remember that the Tibiofemoral Joint was down here between the tibia that's in the front and the femur that's right here. Those same muscles that lived right here that helped me to take the femur and pull it up toward this part of the body, these same muscles, when they're pulling on the tibia, they're going to move the tibia in a way that we call extension. Extension. Here's where those angle words become important. What did we say the angle word was? When we do extension, does the angle get bigger or smaller? Extension. Is the angle bigger or smaller? Yeah, so the angle is going to increase, or the angle gets bigger when we do extension. In flexion, the angle gets smaller. I'm going to draw us a little stick person here to think about this. So my little stick person here is sitting down in a chair, a lot like us. Here is, I need to add some more body parts. Here, let's draw a chair, actually. That'll help. Here we go. Thank you all for being patient with my terrible drawings, right? Okay, we're sitting on an orange chair, right? So yeah, is this like the salty banana? Kind of, right? Okay, so here's our bottom, gluteus maximus up here. Here's the femur, and here's the tibia. Here is the angle that we're talking about. When you're sitting in your chair, here's the angle at our tibiofemoral joint. When I take my leg and I kick it up, we can all do this right now when we're sitting. When you kick your leg up, the amount of space at this angle, at this spot right here, that space gets bigger. My angle gets larger. When your tibia moves toward the front of your body, when you're kicking a ball, that's extension. So I'm going to put that note up here, kicking a ball or moving foot forward. That's called extension. Please, please, we got to memorize that one. Kicking a ball is extension. When you're bringing your leg forward like a high step, that's called flexion because of our angles. So when I kick that leg forward, that's called extension. Extension of the tibia. So if I ask you what these muscles do to the tibia, you would tell me that these muscles extend the tibia. They make the angle at the knee joint get bigger. If I ask you what these muscles do to the femur at the hip joint, we would say that they do flexion because the femur comes closer to the pelvis. We've got to watch our words. If we're talking about what happens with the tibia, these muscles extend it. They pull the tibia forward. They make the angle larger. If we're talking about the muscles that live on the back side, before we said that these were the muscles that extended the femur because they pull the femur back toward the back side of the body. When we talk about what those muscles are doing to the tibia, they're still pulling the tibia toward the back side of the body, but that's called flexion. Let me add my arrow. Because when I move the leg backwards, the size of my angle gets smaller. So moving foot backward, that's called flexion because it's getting closer to your body. Moving the foot forward is called extension because it's getting away. I've talked a lot. I need to be quiet for a moment because I need you all to share your thoughts or your questions. Where are we at with this? Audrey is running. It's a good way to practice, right? To act these things out 100%. Yeah, running in place. Yeah, that's probably better. Unless you're doing class on your cell phone, then you by all means run wherever, right? Yeah, Kaylin's not sure where she's at. Okay, so again, this is where it's going to be really important for us to act these things out. The good news too is if you're sitting in your chair, you can actually put your hands on your thighs and lift your leg up. When you do that, you can feel the muscles on the front side of your thigh contract a little bit. That's extension. When your tibia moves forward, you can feel those muscles on the front doing it. When you bring your leg back down, you can feel those muscles on the back side of your leg bringing the tibia back down. Again, I mentioned you can use your body when you're taking the final exam or when you're doing homework. Please do use your body. If we know where a muscle is, you can feel rectus femoris on yourself, and you can feel, okay, this is a muscle on the front side. What movements can I do to make this muscle contract? Well, if you're sitting in your chair, you can pull that femur up. That would be flexion of the femur. Or I can kick my tibia forward. That would be extension of the tibia. Gonna have to just practice. I know that we always hate to hear that, but this is just gonna be, we're just gonna have to do it over and over and over again to practice what these different muscles do. By the way, this is only our second week learning muscle movements, but next week we're learning more, and the week after that we're learning more. We're building all the way through the second half of the semester with these muscle movements. There is a muscle movement review activity. It's in the week before the lab final exam folder. There's a whole bunch of different review assignments. We can start doing those review assignments now, and I would actually recommend start doing them every single week. There's gonna be a whole bunch of stuff on those review assignments that you don't know yet. So skip the muscles of the arm, skip the muscles of the back, skip the muscles we haven't talked about, but keep reviewing the muscles that we have. Like last week, we did the muscles that helped us to breathe in or to breathe out, to flex forward or sideways with our trunk. The more you can repeat those actions by doing that activity, the better off you're going to be. So check out that, I think it's like the week 15 folder or week 14 folder, the last one that we have for lab. Start doing those review assignments now. By the time we get to the end of the semester, you'll be able to get your 90 or your 100. Right now, we just want to complete them to make sure we haven't forgotten the material from last week. Well, I guess it was 2 weeks ago, spring break, right? So every week, Fanshin's saying every day. I mean, more power to you, right? At least once a week between now and that final exam, do that review assignment. Make sure we're still remembering our action words. That's going to be really important for us. We've talked about moving the femur. We've talked about moving the tibia. The other thing we're talking about this week is moving the foot. So when we talk about moving the foot, we have different words that we use to describe those movements. So one of those words is what we call dorsiflexion, and the other word is called plantar flexion. So plantar flexion, the way that I described this to you before, this is when you go on your tiptoes. So plantar flexion, going on tiptoes. For ladies, plantar flexion is like wearing a pair of heels. That's what you do when you're wearing heels. Yeah, so plantar is the plantar region was on the bottom of your foot, right? So plantar flexion is when we point our toes toward the bottom of our foot or into the ground. Dorsiflexion is when we move our toes toward the back side of our body. So this is when you rock back on heels, rock back on your heels. So the toes go to the back of your body when you're doing dorsiflexion. The toes go to the ground when we're doing plantar flexion. And again, when we talk about plantar flexion, I mentioned this thing wearing a pair of heels because that really helps me to remember which kind of muscles are going to help me out. It's all the muscles that you're trying to show off in heels, right? So it's our friend down here in the back. Does anybody know this one yet? Have we learned this one? The big one on the back side of our leg down here. I'll just get my typer out. Has a long name. That was kind of a mean question, wasn't it? That one's called, yeah, there we go. Gastrocnemius. Gastrocnemius. Honestly, that's the main one we're trying to show off in heels. Gastrocnemius, the one along the very back. Right in front of gastrocnemius is one called soleus. Soleus is this little one right here. Soleus, let me type that. Ooh, I spelled that wrong. Try again. We also ask you to know, I think we had you know this one. Did we have you know this one right here? I think we did. Fibularis Longus. Does that sound familiar? Fibularis Longus. Okay. So this is a muscle that I find on the lateral side of the leg. Fibularis on the fibula side of the leg. Soleus kind of on the lateral side toward the back. Gastrocnemius all the way on the back. All of these are the muscles that you show off when you wear a pair of heels. And that's what we're doing. We're doing plantar flexion. So if you live on the back side of the tibia, you're going to plantar flex the foot. You're going to help the foot go on tiptoes. If you live on the front side of the foot, so our big one, or excuse me, of the tibia, our big one here is one whose name we really like because it tells us exactly where it's found. Tibialis Anterior. That is an anterior muscle. Anterior muscles help us to pull the foot up or help us to rock back on our heels. So the actions we're learning this week: flexing and extending the femur at the hip joint. So basically moving your hip. We're learning abducting and adducting the femur. We're also learning flexion and extension at the knee joint. And then we're learning dorsiflexion and plantar flexion at the ankle joint. Again, strongly recommend don't memorize the particular muscles that are listed underneath these rules in your packet. Memorize the rules and work on memorizing the locations of those muscles on your list. If you can do those things, I promise you'll be able to answer those questions. Because I'll give you a list of muscles and all of the muscles will be on the front except somebody who lives on the back. And if you know what the muscles that do on the front side versus the muscles on the back side, you'll be able to answer the question. And the homework assignment and that review assignment, that's going to be your best bet for practicing those things. Before we transition into that last activity in the lab packet where we're predicting some actions, do we have any questions about labeling muscles or about these action words? Kaylin's mind's blown. I get it. It is pretty mind-blowing. Oh, I made Shanti cry. I'm sorry, Shanti. Again, it's just a practice thing. There's no fast way to learn it, but the more you can act it out and involve that sense of your body and not just vision, reading things, the more you can put actions to it, the more you can say it out loud, the more you can write it. All of those things are going to help you when you're trying to answer questions. So do some interpretive dancing. That's what I always joke with my students about. Let's do some interpretive dancing to figure out what dorsiflexion looks like and flexion of the coxal joint and figure out what it feels like, and then figure out which side of your body does that action. And then we got to learn the names, right? But do it in chunks. Figure out what it feels like, figure out who's moving it, front or back or side, and figure out who lives there. Let's learn it in those little steps. Fanchon says, tell Proctorio to watch out. Yeah, I think you'll be good. I've told every semester, even these online semesters, I always tell students to do that, and it has yet to flag somebody for dancing. So you should be good. I don't think Proctorio is going to freak out too much. As long as you don't do a dance for like 10 minutes, I think it might flag you if you're just going nuts. But a little bit of movement, you should be just fine. Okay. I want to spend the remainder of our class time doing a couple of these activities. For my friends who had a chance to work on these last activities, are there any particular muscles that you would like me to do this with? There's Adductor Group, Gluteus Maximus. Who else do we have? Rectus Femoris, Semitendinosus. Oh, that's it. Any preferences? Or we don't care? Okay, well, I will do Rectus Femoris. I will do maybe Adductor. And then I will open up the floor. I know that Elapina had a question about neurons, so bring it back up after we finish our action stuff here really fast. I'll address that. Same thing, Audrey. I will address your question too. I want to make sure that we get to talk about these activities as well, though. So I want to make sure we have enough time for that. We are going to start. Let me remind you, with these activities, you find them at the end of every lab packet between now and the final exam. Please do these activities multiple times. So if possible, maybe print off multiple versions of this last page here, because this activity is making you pull together a lot of different ideas. It's making you remember some bone markings, like the acetabulum or the tibial tuberosity. It's making you remember your movement words. So when we talk here about increasing the angle, that would be extension, versus decrease in angle, that's flexion. It's making you remember where muscles are found in the body. I think I had mentioned this before, but in case I didn't say it, on the final exam, I'm going to give you a picture like this, or like this here. It's going to be a muscle that has no name. I'm just going to give you the origin with one color and the insertion with another color. And I'm going to ask you to tell me what the action is of that muscle. So these activities, we're working on preparing for that. That's why you see them every single week to get you ready for that midterm. So let's work through Rectus Femoris together. We'll work through the adductor muscle as well. Rectus Femoris is a muscle that we find along the front side of the femur. So we would find Rectus Femoris kind of right about here. Remember that rectus means it's parallel to the midline. So it goes parallel to the femur. We're working on that parallel muscle right here. Every muscle has origins and insertions. Origins and insertions. When I talk about the origin of a muscle, is the origin the part that does or does not move when a muscle contracts? The origin does or does not move when a muscle contracts. Yeah, exactly. So the origin is the part where there is no movement. No movement. Okay. Which means that my insertions, which we will also label, my insertions are the place where there is movement. There is movement. So let's look at our list here. Rectus femoris has two origins, meaning two places it attaches where there's no movement. One of those places is on the ilium, and one of those places is the acetabulum. Now here's where you might have to refer back to last week's packet. Remember that the acetabulum was that big indentation where the femur fit into the hip bones. The hip bones is a group called os coxae, the hip bones. So I've got an attachment site that's here inside the acetabulum, and we're attached to the ilium as well. So I'm going to draw my little blue patch up here. We're attached to the ilium, and we're attached to the acetabulum. Here's my non-moving attachment site for rectus femoris. My moving attachment sites, called the insertions, are the patella and the tibial tuberosity on the tibia. Now, we haven't really talked about bone markings on the tibia, but we have talked about this word tuberosity. We talked about that before the midterm. Do you happen to remember what kind of bone marking word a tuberosity is? Tuberosity? Yeah, there we go. Fanchin remembers that's a bump. A tuberosity is a fancy word for a bump. So when you're studying and labeling your bone markings this week, the tibial tuberosity, that's the big bump. Again, you can actually feel this on yourself, on your tibia. It's a part that sticks up just below your knee joint. I always bump mine into stuff. So there's my tibial tuberosity, and then my patella as well. It's right here. So all of this is kind of attachment sites for rectus femoris. So I've got my moving attachment site, and I've got my non-moving attachment site. Now I get to play connect the dots to draw rectus femoris. Remember, rectus femoris is the one that goes straight up and down on your thigh. So here's rectus femoris, here's the insertion, here's the origin. When we're talking about rectus femoris, I could ask you two kinds of questions. I could ask you what this muscle does at the hip joint, at the coxal joint, or I could ask you what it does at the knee joint. So notice that this is a muscle on the anterior side of the thigh, and it's moving, or it's pulling on the tibia. So I want all of you sitting down. I want you with your leg, put your hand on your thigh, and I want you to lift your leg up. You should feel a little bit of movement on the front side where you put your hand, where rectus femoris is when we put our leg up. When we put our leg back down, it just relaxes in that area. You don't feel the contraction like you feel when you lift it up. When I take this insertion and I move it toward my origin, that's what you're doing. So if you touch that bump that's just below your knee, and then you move that bump toward your hip, that's when you're pulling your tibia forward. That's when we are increasing the angle at the knee joint. That's when we're doing extension. Rectus femoris at the knee joint is doing extension because we're moving this bone marking, or this bone, toward the other one. We're making a greater angle. So we're going from where, remember, we're sitting in the chair and we're bent, and then we move that leg forward. That increases the angle. If I had asked you, instead of being at the knee joint, if I had instead asked you about the hip joint, when I take your patella and I move that patella toward the hips, my angle actually gets smaller at the coxal joint. Yeah, so now if we were talking about what rectus femoris did, not at the knee joint, but if we were talking about what rectus femoris did at the hip joint, or what's technically called the coxal joint, we would say that rectus femoris actually flexes the coxal joint because it decreases the angle between the femur and the pelvis. So my attachment site, my insertion, always moves toward my origin. If we're talking about my insertion on the patella and I move the patella closer to the hip, causing my whole femur to move, that's going to be flexion at the coxal joint. If I don't really move my patella and it's all about what goes on with my tibia down here, that's going to be making my tibia go closer to the hip joint up here. We're separating out that angle between the femur and the tibia. I don't know why I just am now paying attention to this. I made myself this sideways skeleton because that'll be easier for you to see. Let me just show you. Check this out. We'll end with this. Here's the exact same thing on a sideways skeleton. If I pull on my joint, so I'm going this way, right? If I pull this insertion toward this origin, if we move this way, so we're moving forward at the hip joint, that's bringing the femur closer to the pelvis. That would be flexion of the femur at the coxal joint. If I take this right here, my tibia, and I move it this direction, I'm actually making the angle back here at my knee joint, I'm actually making that bigger. That's extension. So imagine, instead of standing like that, imagine that you're standing like this. When I contract rectus femoris, I take my tibia that's back here and I pull it down into this position. That's what rectus femoris does. It increases the angle at the knee joint. Here's that angle that's small when it's bent. It gets much larger when I put my foot down. When rectus femoris contracts, it helps me to put my foot down. And when I put my foot down, that does extension. That increases the angle. When I talk about taking my leg and going like this person's all kind of crazy, right? If I take my leg from this position and I pull it like this, now these two things got closer together. That's flexion. So extension at the knee joint, flexion at the hip joint. All of this based on the fact that my insertion, my moving part, is down here, and it's always going toward my non-moving part right here. I suspect we are 100% still processing this, because this is one of those things we got to think through. If you have a question now that you can put to words, I'm happy to answer it. I suspect we're more likely to watch the recording and process through it again, which is totally fine. Kaylin asked what our AMP term is for having your mind completely blown. I will have to consider that. For now, I'm going to say learning. How about that? My mind is completely blown. I'm learning. Okay. Well, before I close out the recording, I know that Elapina had a question related to the different cells, correct? With neurons, the helper cells. Let me go back really fast to our picture of the neurons. Right up here. Okay. Elapina asked a good question. And the question was the difference between a Schwann cell and an oligodendrocyte. Let me type the name of those ones here. Oligodendrocyte. Schwann cells and oligodendrocytes do exactly the same thing. They're just found in different places. So the models that we're looking at, we can see Schwann cells. Schwann cells are the cells that make a myelin sheath around our axons, but they are only found in what's called the peripheral nervous system. Peripheral nervous system. Yeah, abbreviated, which would have been way easier, right? PNS, peripheral nervous system. This is going to be all of your spinal nerves, all of your cranial nerves, everything that branches off of the central nervous system. So the central nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord. That's the only places that are part of the central nervous system. If you don't live in the brain or the spinal cord, you are part of the peripheral nervous system. And the way that you build your myelin sheaths is using these Schwann cells. If you are a neuron and you live in the brain or the spinal cord, the way that you make your myelin sheaths is using a cell called oligodendrocytes. So oligodendrocytes are doing the same job as Schwann cells. They're just doing it in the brain and the spinal cord. The thing with an oligodendrocyte is they look a lot different than Schwann cells do. So oligodendrocytes, this is going to be my terrible drawing here. Oligodendrocytes have a whole lot of extensions coming off of them where they make a myelin sheath around a lot of different neurons. So let me add some neurons here. We're going to pretend that these cells don't look as absolutely terrible as they do. So I've got neurons here that have an axon. When we talk about an oligodendrocyte, oligodendrocytes, they make myelin sheaths around multiple neurons at the same time, oligodendrocytes. So multiple neurons, and they're found in the central nervous system, in the CNS. So my black cell here, I'll give it a nucleus. This is my oligodendrocyte. All of these areas here are the myelin sheaths that it's making around lots of different neurons. So oligodendrocytes builds myelin sheaths for many different neurons at once. A Schwann cell only builds the myelin sheath around a little tiny space of one neuron. So Schwann cells are really dedicated to taking care of one neuron, whereas oligodendrocytes take care of many neurons at the same time. Oligodendrocytes only in the brain and the spinal cord, whereas those Schwann cells all over the place in the peripheral nervous system. Does that address your question, Elipina? If I had read it right before, I think that's what it was. Perfect. Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and end our recording. I will stick around for a bit here with any questions that you have. Tomorrow we are going to start the lesson number 9 for lecture. Here is my wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Lesson number 9 and lesson number 10. So muscular system and neurons. Honestly, these are probably 2 of the most challenging lectures that we're going to do. Not because the ideas are necessarily hard, but because it's processes. It's something that we really have to understand. So if you have time today and tomorrow before we come to class, please try to start lesson number 9 to get you ready for tomorrow's lecture class. We will try to get through about half of it tomorrow and then talk about the rest of it next week. So plan to try to do a little bit of lecture work tonight to get you ready for that, and plan to try to keep working on that throughout the weekend and into next week. Lesson number 9 and lesson number 10, the 2 that we have coming up. All right, I'm going to turn off our recording I hope to see you all tomorrow at 1 o'clock, and I'll stick around here for a bit here in the classroom.